Mandalorians are one of the most fractured civilizations in all of Star Wars. Dozens of clans, factions, and splinter groups, each one convinced they're the real Mandalorians and everyone else is a pretender. So today I'm breaking down every single Mandalorian clan and faction, what they believe, why they fight, and how they all connect. Starting with the one that has zero ideology and zero loyalty to anyone but themselves, Clan Saxon. If you want to understand why Mandalorian culture is so fractured, start here. Clan Saxon is the baseline. No sacred creed, no pacifist charter, no ancient code of honor. Just territorial expansion through raw combat and opportunism. Here's the thing, most Mandalorian factions on this list exist because they're reacting against something. Clan Saxon is what they're reacting against. Now, fans get confused because the Saxon name shows up in two very different contexts. Gar Saxon is the canon version, an imperial loyalist who governed Mandalore under the Empire's thumb. But in Legends, Tiber Saxon is a separate character entirely, a warlord operating independently with zero imperial allegiance. Two timelines, two different men, same family name, but what matters about both versions is that neither one fights for tradition. They chase resources, territory, and power. Full stop. That makes them ideologically flexible in a way every other faction on this list refuses to be, and that's exactly why every faction after this one gets progressively more rigid, more ideological, and more extreme. Speaking of which, the next clan on our list started with literally 2 members, and one of them isn't even human. Clan Mudhorn. Every Mandalorian clan has centuries of history, legendary warriors, and ancient rivalries behind their name. Clan Mudhorn has a bounty hunter and a baby who couldn't even talk yet, and somehow, it's one of the most compelling clans in the entire franchise. Here's the thing, Clan Mudhorn's origin story is genuinely absurd when you break it down. Din Djarin and Grogu earned their clan signet by nearly getting killed by a Mudhorn, a giant charging beast that would have flattened Din if Grogu hadn't instinctively used the Force to hold it in place. That's it. That's the founding myth. 2 strangers who'd known each other for maybe a few weeks, one of whom was an infant, barely survived a monster and got a coat of arms out of it. But that chaos is exactly what makes it work. Because Din Djarin was himself a foundling, adopted into Mandalorian culture after separatist droids destroyed his village. Therefore, when he takes Grogu under his protection, he's not just continuing a tradition, he's reliving his own rescue from the other side. The clan isn't built on conquest or bloodlines. It's built on one guy deciding a kid matters more than a bounty. At its peak, Clan Mudhorn has maybe 3 or 4 members depending on how you count. It has 0 territory, 0 political influence, and its leader keeps breaking his own religious rules. Din removes his helmet, atones for it, then eventually removes it again. The clan's ideology bends to fit whoever Din is becoming at any given moment, which is the opposite of how Mandalorian tradition is supposed to work. But that flexibility might be exactly why it survives when rigid clans don't. Speaking of rigid, Clan Eldar takes tradition in a very different direction. Clan Eldar. Here's the honest truth about Clan Eldar. We barely know anything, and that's not me being lazy with the research. That's the actual situation. Clan Eldar is confirmed to exist in Mandalorian canon, but they show up in supplementary reference materials and fragmentary mentions rather than anything you'd actually watch on screen. No major characters, no dramatic betrayals, no last stands. They're a ghost entry in the Mandalorian registry. Their leadership structure? Unclear. Their active membership numbers? Unknown. Alleged mercenary work? Maybe. But the documentation is thin enough that even dedicated fans routinely leave them off comprehensive clan lists. You could spend years deep in Star Wars lore and never once encounter their name. But here's where it gets interesting, because Clan Eldar might actually represent the most realistic version of Mandalorian life. Think about it. For every clan Kryze ruling a planet or Death Watch launching a civil war, there had to be dozens of clans just quietly existing. Working jobs, taking contracts, not making history. Clan Eldar is the Mandalorian majority, the clans that didn't pick a side loudly enough to get remembered, and therefore didn't survive the Purge, with anyone left to tell their story. That absence says something. An entire clan can exist within one of the galaxy's most legendary warrior cultures and still vanish without leaving a trace. No monument, no survivor carrying the name forward, just a line in a reference book that fewer people have read than you'd think. But if Clan Eldar represents the clan's history forgot, the next one is a clan that made absolutely sure nobody could forget them. Clan Ren. Clan Ren did something that most Mandalorian factions would never even consider. They worked for the Empire, not as conquered subjects, not as prisoners, but as paid mercenaries who chose collaboration because it kept them alive and powerful. And honestly, that pragmatism is exactly what makes them so interesting. But here's where it gets complicated. While serving the Empire, Sabine Wren, the clan's most famous member, created something called the Arc Pulse Generator. And if you don't know what that is, it's essentially a super weapon designed to target Beskar armor specifically. Let that really hit you for a second. She built a weapon that turns the most sacred symbol of Mandalorian identity into a death sentence for anyone wearing it. A Mandalorian built the one thing that kills Mandalorians better than anything else in the galaxy. That's not just irony, that's the most Clan Wren thing imaginable, turning culture itself into a tactical asset. Back home on Crownest, the family was fracturing under the pressure of Imperial loyalty. Ursa Wren, the matriarch, played the political game carefully, keeping her people alive through cautious diplomacy. Tristan Wren, Sabine's brother, stayed loyal to the Empire as a soldier because that's what survival looked like from the inside. Their entire arc in Rebels is a family being ripped apart by ideology and slowly stitching itself back together. But here's the thing. After the Great Purge wiped out more rigid clans, Clan Wren survived. Their flexibility, the same trait that made them Imperial collaborators, is exactly what kept them breathing when purists got destroyed. Fans still debate whether Sabine should have claimed leadership of all Mandalore, and that argument has real weight because no other clan adapted like the Wrens did. But adaptation is one thing. Ruling Mandalore through birthright, that's Clan Kry's territory. And their story makes the Wrens look simple by comparison. Clan Kry's one family produced two rulers who couldn't have disagreed more on what Mandalore was supposed to be. Duchess Satine Kryze dismantled the entire warrior culture, stripped it down to pacifism and diplomacy, and governed Mandalore through the Clone Wars as a neutral state. Her sister Bo-Katan wanted the exact opposite. And the tragedy is that both of them were right, and both of them lost everything anyway. Satine's vision was genuinely radical. She took a civilization defined by centuries of combat and told them to put the weapons down. And it worked, at least for a while. Mandalore under her rule was stable, democratic, and peaceful. But here's where it gets dark. Darth Maul didn't just conquer Mandalore to seize power. He killed Satine specifically to destroy Bo-Katan's will to fight. He murdered her sister right in front of her, knowing the psychological damage would ripple through every loyalist in Clan Kryze. It did. Bo-Katan spent the next 2 decades trying to figure out what she was even fighting for. In Clone Wars, she's a Death Watch lieutenant rebelling against her own sister's government. In Rebels, she's reluctantly accepting the Darksaber to unite the clans. By The Mandalorian, she's a warlord without a world, leading a scattered handful of loyalists with zero territory and fading legitimacy. Her entire arc is one long identity crisis dressed up as a military campaign, and there's one more wrinkle the community loves to chew on. Fans have long speculated that Satine may have had a biological child with Obi-Wan Kenobi, pointing to Corky Kryze as possible evidence. Nothing confirmed, but the theory refuses to die. 2 sisters, 1 clan name, completely opposite philosophies, and neither one got the ending they deserved. But if Clan Kryze's story is about political tragedy, the next faction is about something far more mercenary: House Caste. Every faction on this list fought the Empire, fled from the Empire, or hid from the Empire. House Caste joined it, and that single decision makes them the most controversial name in Mandalorian history. Here's the thing. After the Great Purge devastated Mandalore, Gar Saxon looked at the smoldering remains of his homeworld and made a calculation. Rather than resist an empire that had just proven it could annihilate everything Mandalorians held sacred, he offered his services. The Empire didn't just accept, and they made him governor. Saxon became the imperial hand on Mandalore's throat, and House Caste became the fist. But this wasn't some skeleton crew of turncoats. At peak strength, House Caste commanded over 500 soldiers operating as Imperial super commandos. That made them one of the largest organized Mandalorian forces during the entire Imperial era. 500 warriors in full Beskar, trained in Mandalorian combat traditions, fighting for the people who destroyed Mandalore. The irony is almost physically painful, and that's where the real debate starts. Was Saxon a pragmatist who kept Mandalorians alive by working within the system, or was he a traitor who sold his people's freedom for a governor's title? Fans have argued this for years, and honestly the answer depends on how you read occupation politics. History is full of collaborators who claimed they were protecting their people from the inside. History also shows us how that usually ends. For Saxon, it ended with his death around 5 ABY, and the moment he died, House Caste collapsed completely. No succession plan, no independent power base, no identity beyond one man's deal with one regime. 500 soldiers, and not a single one could hold the faction together without Imperial backing. That tells you everything about what House Caste actually was. Not a Mandalorian house built on Mandalorian strength, but an Imperial puppet with Beskar paint. But if House Caste represents Mandalorian identity at its most compromised, almost the next faction represents it at its most ancient and ambitious. House Vizsla. Here's the thing about House Vizsla that changes how you understand Mandalorian politics entirely. They weren't rebels, they weren't insurgents, they were the government. Before Duchess Satine and her pacifist movement took control, House Vizsla held legitimate political authority over Mandalore. Noble lineage, institutional power, the whole structure. They had the legal framework to rule, and they used it. Their engineers built the Vizsla siege cannons, weapons specifically designed to destroy Jedi temples. Not starships, not military bases, Jedi temples. That tells you exactly how this house thought about power. You don't engineer siege weapons targeting religious architecture unless you've decided that the biggest threat to your civilization wears robes and carries a lightsaber. But here's where the contradiction starts eating itself alive. Pre-Vizsla inherited all of that noble authority. He governed Concordia, one of Mandalore's moons, as a legitimate political leader. On paper, he was a respected noble operating within the system. But behind closed doors, he was simultaneously commanding the Death Watch, a militant faction that wanted to burn that same system to the ground and rebuild Mandalore through violence. Think about that for a second. He was running a government and a death cult at the same time, and this is the distinction that trips up almost every fan. House Vizsla is the legal structure, the noble house. The paperwork yielded the political claim, the institutional legitimacy. Clan Vizsla is the warrior identity, the ideology, the combat tradition, the cultural backbone. Pre-Vizsla tried to wield both simultaneously, using his noble authority to shield his militant operations while using his militant operations to seize the power his noble title couldn't deliver alone. That contradiction didn't make him stronger. It destroyed him, because you can't claim institutional legitimacy while actively undermining the institution. Eventually one identity has to win, and for Pre-Vizsla, neither did. But if you want to understand what the warrior side of that equation actually looked like on its own, that's a different story entirely. Clan Vizsla. Here's the thing about Clan Vizsla. They weren't rebels. They weren't terrorists, at least not in their own minds. They were making an argument. A coherent, internally logical argument that Mandalorian culture had lost its way, and the only path back was through the barrel of a blaster. Where House Vizsla held political legitimacy, the noble lineage, the governing authority, Clan Vizsla stripped all of that away and replaced it with something rawer. Their claim to power wasn't bloodline, it was combat. You want to lead Mandalore? Fight for it. Prove you deserve it. That's not villainy. That's the oldest Mandalorian tradition there is. Pre-Vizsla declared himself Mandalore in 19 BBY, and he didn't inherit the title or get elected to it. He seized it through force and ideology, which was philosophically consistent with centuries of Mandalorian warrior culture. But here's where it gets complicated. By Mandalore's own contemporary governing standards, in the ones established by the new Mandalorians, his claim was completely illegitimate. He was using ancient rules to override a modern system, and calling anyone who disagreed a traitor to their heritage. The Death Watch wasn't just Clan Vizsla's military wing, it was the ideological engine. The entire clan functioned as a project to reverse Mandalore's cultural drift toward pacifism and governance. Every recruitment drive, every terrorist attack, every public challenge to Satine's authority was designed to prove one thing, that a Mandalorian who doesn't fight isn't a Mandalorian at all. But the poetry of Pre-Vizsla's story is in how it ends. When Maul challenged him for leadership, Pre-Vizsla accepted. He had to. His entire philosophy demanded it. Combat determines legitimacy. The strongest warrior rules. Those were his rules, and Maul was stronger. Pre-Vizsla died because the system he built worked exactly as designed. He created a world where power flows to the best fighter, then lost a fight. If you accept his clan's own logic, his death wasn't unjust. It was inevitable. That's the fatal flaw of combat determines everything as a governing philosophy. Eventually, someone better shows up. But if Clan Vizsla represented the extreme of warrior traditionalism, the faction that comes next swung the pendulum so far in the opposite direction that it nearly erased Mandalorian identity entirely. The New Mandalorians. Every faction we've covered so far accepted one basic premise, that being Mandalorian means being a warrior. The new Mandalorians looked at that premise and said no, and for over 20 years, they actually made it work. Duchess Satine Kryze led a pacifist government on Mandalore that did something nobody thought was possible. She disarmed an entire warrior culture, not through military conquest, but through political ideology. Civic institutions replaced warlords, diplomacy replaced Beskar, Mandalore allied with the Republic, built a functioning democracy, and for 2 decades, nobody died over who got to sit on the throne. But here's the part that makes this even more fascinating. In Legends, the philosophical roots of Mandalorian pacifism stretch back roughly 3,000 years. This wasn't some Clone Wars invention. Pacifist Mandalorians have been a recurring ideological current throughout their entire history, rising and falling like a tide that keeps coming back no matter how many times the warrior class stamps it out. And Satine wasn't some naive figurehead. She wielded real political capital, enough that Death Watch, a fully armed militant faction, couldn't remove her through conventional means. They had to resort to terrorism, and even that wasn't enough. It literally took a Sith Lord, Darth Maul himself, to finally bring her government down. When your political enemies need to recruit one of the most dangerous beings in the galaxy just to unseat you, you're doing something right. Here's where the fan debate gets genuinely interesting though. The common take is that the Purge proved Satine was naive, that pacifism was always doomed in a galaxy this violent. But think about what actually happened. The new Mandalorians didn't collapse from internal failure. They were dismantled by Maul, manipulated by Palpatine, and eventually crushed by Imperial intervention. External forces destroyed them. That's not the same thing as failing on your own terms. It's the difference between a house falling down because it was poorly built and a house getting hit by a missile. The new Mandalorians asked whether Mandalorian identity had to mean violence at all. They got surprisingly far with that answer before the galaxy decided for them. But if pacifism represents one extreme of what it means to be Mandalorian, the next faction represents the attempt to find the middle ground, a warrior code built on honor rather than ideology, the true Mandalorians. Every faction on this list claims to represent the real Mandalorian way. The pacifists say it's about evolving past violence. The Death Watch says it's about preserving warrior tradition at all costs. The Children of the Watch say it's about rigid adherence to sacred law. But there was one group that actually tried to define what real Mandalorian meant, write it down, and build a society around it. And by the time anyone in the modern Star Wars era goes looking for them, they're basically gone. In Legends continuity, the true Mandalorians were led by Jango Fett, and their entire philosophy was built on a single radical idea: merit, not bloodline, not clan politics, not religious fanaticism. Your rank, your respect, your standing within the group, all of it was earned through skill and conduct. You fought well, you followed the code, you moved up, you didn't, that's it. But here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't just a military structure. It was a deliberate rejection of everything that kept tearing Mandalorian society apart. The true Mandalorians looked at centuries of clan infighting, political backstabbing, and ideological extremism, and said, what if we just stopped doing all of that? They positioned themselves as the middle ground between Satine's pacifism and Death Watch's bloodlust, warriors with discipline and a unified honor code rather than warriors chasing glory or politicians pretending the armor was decorative. And it worked. For a while, the tragedy is that the true Mandalorians were effectively wiped out, largely destroyed through betrayal and external manipulation. Therefore, by the time the Clone Wars roll around, by the time Din Djarin is wandering the galaxy, by the time Bo-Katan is trying to reclaim Mandalore, the true Mandalorians exist only as an idea, a ghost, the standard that every other faction measures itself against and falls short of. Now, important caveat, almost everything we know about the true Mandalorians comes from Legends material. In current canon, Jango Fett's connection to them is murky at best, and some details outright contradict newer lore. The faction's scope, their numbers, even whether Jango was truly their leader or just associated with them, shifts depending on which source you're reading, but that ambiguity almost makes them more powerful as a concept. They're the Mandalorian faction that exists primarily as a cultural memory, the proof that unity was possible and the reminder that it didn't last. Every clan, every splinter group, and every zealot with a jetpack is essentially chasing what the true Mandalorians briefly achieved. And if you think a faction built on honor and discipline sounds noble, wait until you meet the group that decided honor was weakness and discipline meant something far more violent: the Death Watch. Death Watch wasn't just a rebel faction, it was a funeral for everything Mandalore was becoming. Their name wasn't a metaphor or a cool branding choice. It was a literal statement of belief that Mandalorian identity without combat is death. Not figuratively, actually dead. A walking corpse wearing the skin of a culture that no longer exists. And here's the thing, they weren't entirely wrong about the problem. The new Mandalorians under Duchess Satine were actively dismantling centuries of warrior tradition, melting down armor, in discouraging combat training, turning Mandalore into something unrecognizable. If you'd spent your entire life defined by a warrior code and watched your government erase it in a single generation, you'd be furious too. But Death Watch took that legitimate grief and turned it into something monstrous. With roughly 200 active soldiers during the Clone Wars, they weren't a massive army. They were an ideological pressure cooker. Pre Vizsla led them from the shadows of Concordia, publicly playing the role of a reasonable governor while secretly building a terrorist network. They allied with Count Dooku when it was convenient, accepted separatist weapons and funding, then turned on him when the deal stopped serving them. They burned villages on Karlak. They terrorized civilians on Mandalore itself. Every alliance was temporary, and every principle was negotiable, except the core belief that Mandalore must fight or die. But here's where it gets complicated. When Maul showed up and offered them real power, Pre Vizsla took the deal. Together they built the Shadow Collective, united criminal syndicates across the galaxy, and orchestrated a takeover of Mandalore that actually worked. Vizsla got his throne, therefore Maul was supposed to be discarded, but Vizsla underestimated the Sith Lord catastrophically, challenged him to single combat for the Darksaber, and lost his head for it, literally. That death shattered Death Watch permanently. Half followed Maul. The other half, led by Bo-Katan Kryze, refused to kneel to an outsider. And Bo-Katan's journey from that moment forward is one of the most underappreciated character arcs in Star Wars. She started as a Death Watch lieutenant who burned villages and followed a terrorist. She ended up leading the very culture Death Watch tried to weaponize, carrying the weight of every terrible thing she'd done while trying to rebuild something worth saving. The faction itself died with Pre Vizsla, but its ideological children survived, and they took the helmet rule to places even Death Watch never imagined, the Children of the Watch. Every faction on this list chose their path. The Kryzes chose pacifism, Death Watch chose war, the true Mandalorians chose honor. But the Children of the Watch didn't choose anything. Their ideology was handed to them by catastrophe, and they were told it was sacred. That distinction matters more than anything else in this video. After the Great Purge nearly wiped Mandalorians from existence, the survivors who would become the Children of the Watch did something deeply human. They took the worst thing that ever happened to them and built a religion around making sure it could never happen again. The helmet rule, the foundling rituals, the absolute obedience to the way, none of it is ancient tradition. It's a trauma response dressed in Beskar, and here's where it gets complicated. The Armorer, their spiritual leader, across the first 2 seasons of The Mandalorian, guided roughly 20 to 50 members from a network of caves beneath Navarro. That's not a faction. That's a support group with flamethrowers. They couldn't grow through recruitment because their rules were too extreme for mainstream Mandalorians, so instead they adopted foundlings, raising children inside the doctrine before those children were old enough to question it. That's not cultural preservation. That's cultural reproduction through isolation. The same mechanism every cult in human history has used to survive. But the show knows this. That's exactly why Din Djarin exists as a character. Din is the test case for everything the Children of the Watch believe. He follows the way with absolute devotion for years, and then the galaxy forces him to choose between his creed and his kid. He removes the helmet. He breaks the rule. And according to the Armorer, he's no longer a Mandalorian. But here's the thing. He doesn't stop being Mandalorian. He just stops being their version of one. His redemption arc in Season 3, bathing in the living waters beneath the mines of Mandalore, traces the tension between doctrine and decency, between what the rules say and what a father knows is right. The Armorer herself remains one of the most fascinating loose threads in the show. 3 seasons, and we know almost nothing about her origins. That opacity might be a deliberate creative choice, or it might be the show quietly acknowledging something profound. In a cult, the leader's personal story doesn't matter. The institution is the point. The individual disappears behind the mask, literally, and that's the psychological core of every faction we've covered today. Mandalorian culture, across every clan and every splinter group, is a story about people deciding what their armor means. Whether it's a political statement, a warrior's birthright, a mercenary's uniform, or a sacred covenant you die before breaking, the Children of the Watch just happen to be the faction where that question hurts the most. because their answer wasn't chosen freely. It was forged in fire, passed down to orphans, and called holy. And one man, in a helmet, spent 3 seasons slowly figuring out the difference between tradition and trauma. That's not just the most human story in Mandalorian culture. It might be the most human story in Star Wars. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.